Well, good morning and welcome to the Justice Committee's 27th meeting of 2019. We have no apologies. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. And the question is items 6 and 7, which are to consider a pre-budget scrutiny and report on our work programme. Is the committee content to take these in private? Thank you. Agenda item 2 is an evidence session on the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill. I refer members to paper 1, which is note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. And I welcome our witnesses this morning, Humza Yousaf, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Angela Davidson, Head of Policy Powers Unit, Elaine Hamilton, Head of Forensic Policy, David Murdoch, Scottish Government Legal Directorate. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you very much. And my apologies for running late and interfering with your business. I'd like to thank the Justice Committee very much for its scrutiny of the bill to date and the stakeholders who have contributed to developing this very important piece of legislation. The Scottish Biometrics Commissioner Bill speaks to some of the key societal issues of our time, touching on human rights and ethics as they relate to police use of very personal information indeed. I want to ensure that our approach to biometric data, including new technologies such as facial recognition software, is effective, is proportionate and, of course, ethical. This bill creates an independent commissioner to advise on these issues and to oversee police policy and practice. My ultimate goal is to keep communities safe while obviously respecting the rights of individuals and improving the accountability of the police. The oversight arrangements contained in the bill will apply to Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority. The Commissioner's general function is to support and promote the adoption of lawful, ethical and effective practices in relation to collection, use, retention and disposal of biometric data in the context of policing and criminal justice. Another important function is promoting public awareness of biometric data and how police powers are exercised and indeed may be challenged. The Commissioner will also prepare and promote a code of practice which may set out the standards and responsibilities of Police Scotland and the SPA with the aims of ensuring good practice, driving continuous improvement and enhancing accountability. The code will be subject to consultation and the approval of both Scottish ministers and indeed the Parliament. To enable the Commissioner to perform his or her functions, the Commissioner will have the power to request information. Having considered the information, the Commissioner can make a recommendation with a requirement to respond. If no response is forthcoming, then the Commissioner could publicise this fact. Therefore, there is a sanction to name and shame, so to speak. In conclusion, through this bill, Scotland will have a Commissioner who will encourage and support the fulfilment by Police Scotland and the SPA of their functions in a manner that respects fundamental human rights, the law and the laws of ethics as well. That support will include promoting good practice, identifying systemic deficiencies and providing a degree and a measure of transparency, which together will promote public confidence in policing and in the criminal justice system. I'm happy to respond obviously to any questions the members have at committee today. I look forward to consideration in due course of the committee's report at stage 1 and any recommendations it may well make.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. When we've taken evidence from stakeholders, a number have mentioned that the bill does not principally define the Commissioner as a body with powers to scrutinise the police in relation to the use of biometrics. Instead, it refers to the general function which you've described to support, promote, adoption of lawful and ethical practices. Do you think the bill should be strengthened and the Commissioner's powers should be strengthened so that they do have that scrutiny and perhaps investigation role?
Well, I thank the Convener for what I think is a really important question. I know this has come out of a number of evidence sessions that you've taken and evidence that you've taken in this very regard. And it seems to be a kind of common thread throughout some of the questioning and indeed some of the answers. I was particularly taken by Paul Wyle's evidence here to this committee in relation to the bill. And I do think that the sanction of name and shame should not be seen as a light touch option. When you talk about, I think in your question, you talked about the kind of strengthening of the Commissioner's role. We shouldn't think that that naming and shaming sanction is a light one at all. And I thought that came through from the evidence that you took in relation to the Commissioner in England and Wales. The careful consideration was absolutely given in relation to the scope, the functions, the powers of the Commissioner. I suppose the other thing we had to be really mindful of, Convener, was not duplicating or indeed stepping onto the role of course, the Information Commissioner as well, and other existing regulators, but particularly the Information Commissioner. So it was important for us not to step over onto that. As I say, Professor Paul Wiles, he provided evidence to the committee suggesting that he didn't necessarily need, in his kind of equivalent role, specific enforcement powers. His experience was the police and the other authorities were relatively open in terms of the discussion. Any failure to have regard to the code of practice, of course, can also result in notification to Scottish ministers in Parliament, and as I say, that public sanction, that naming and shaming, is something that can have quite an effect, I think, on police, and I'm certain the police would not want to be in that position. So careful consideration was given, but I think we've got the right balance, because the relationship, the dynamic of the relationship between the Commissioner and Police Scotland and the SPA will also be very important as well. So I think we've got the right balance.
Mm-hmm. Given that it's about confidence too that the public must have in this legislation and the power to collect personal data, my understanding is that the IOC was quite supportive of the Biometrics Committee in their having a stronger role, and suggested that they could work together and would complement. So the fear perhaps that you have there might be a duplication could be overcome. Is this something you would be prepared to look at, Cabinet Secretary, as we move forward with the bill?
I mean, as always, Convener, we had a very positive relationship with this committee in relation to the recommendations it's often brought forward with legislation. You know, we'll be open-minded to suggestions that come forward. My very resolute belief at the moment as things stand is that we have the right balance, and we want to ensure that the dynamic of the relationship between the Commissioner and Police Scotland and the SPA is a positive one, but also one and really quite an open one, but also where if ever gets to the point that Police Scotland or the SPA are not complying, then the Commissioner feels he or she has enough powers to get them to have regard to that. And I think we've got that balance just about right. But clearly, I will wait to see what the Stage 1 report comes forward with in relation to recommendation. But at this point, I would envisage changing that role too much further in relation to sanction. And also, you know, I view the roles, as I've said in my last answer, of the Information Commissioner and the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner as complementary. And I just don't want there to be any particular overlap. But your points on that, I think, are now made and on the record. So clearly, we'll give consideration to whatever the report from this committee comes forward with.
Lee MacArthur.
In your opening remarks about building public confidence in terms of the activities of SPA and Police Scotland, it would be helpful maybe if you could set out a little bit more detail how you think the functions of the Commissioner will give rise to that public confidence across all of the biometric technologies that Police Scotland and SPA use. And in particular, again, I think you noted the public debate around facial recognition technology, and therefore would you expect an assessment of live facial recognition technology to be a priority for the Commissioner?
I thank a member who I know has had a long-standing interest in these kind of matters. I will take the question in the two parts that he presents them. I think the public confidence piece is hugely important. I do think there's a high degree of public confidence in Police Scotland. We see that through criminal justice surveys and so on and so forth that point towards that. But the member's absolutely correct. Whenever there are new technologies, in particularly those that have a biometric element to them, I think that it's really important that the public are given as much reassurance as possible. So how is that done? One is that the Biometrics Commissioner's role should not be seen in isolation. There are a number of other structures that are being put in place to help to complement that. You'll know the IAG's recommendation of an ethics advisory group, so that will be alongside the Commissioner to provide that expert advice and opinion. I've come to the subcommittee on policing, which the member sits, of course, to talk about the group that I want to set up and my officers are working on in relation to looking at technology coming down the line as well, and how we ensure that the ethical frameworks around that are positive. That was largely in relation to the subcommittee's work on what was known as cyber kiosks or digital triage devices. So we have the Information Commissioner plus a whole suite of other measures. Really important when it comes to code of practice that consultation is part of that. Now the bill talks about and certainly prescribes those organisations that the Commissioner should consult with, but also has a catch-all there that any other relevant stakeholders. And it may well be from the Commissioner, and I don't want to prejudge, of course, but the Commissioner may well think it a good idea to consult with the public wider on any code of practice as well, and I certainly would think that would be a positive step. So I think there's a number of ways that we can build public confidence. On the second part of his question, which is about facial recognition, which largely comes into two parts, and I think maybe the part that's most relevant to his question is live facial recognition. So the technology is we're now starting to see being piloted, for example, by the Met, or I think it's South Wales Police as well, where you can go into a concert and essentially faces can match up images that may well police might have on their database. That is exactly the type of technology that will fall into the scope of the Biometrics Commissioner, but also you would think any code of practice, and is exactly the type of technology that should be rigorously assessed in terms of the effect or not it would have, on human rights and ethics as well. So he's right to raise that. I think it's one of the most important issues with biometrics moving forward.
That's very helpful, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, I would take by implication from what you're saying that you very much would see that as being a priority area. In the sense, there'll be a lot of work to be done, probably in the early stages. But given some of the discussion around the use of live facial recognition technology, you would expect that to be an area of priority for the Commissioner.
I would suspect, so I suppose the only caveat I would say to that is my understanding is, and these are operational matters of course, but my understanding is that live facial recognition isn't used here by Police Scotland, so it may well be, so no doubt they're looking at the pilots that are taking place in the Met and South Wales Police. Excuse me. So it may well be that a priority is on existing technology that is being used with a view to also looking at emerging technologies down in the future. But either way, yes, I think facial recognition, live facial recognition, will certainly be one of the priority areas that will be looked at.
Okay. John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary Pan.
Morning.
Cabinet Secretary, it's been suggested that the Commissioner's responsibilities be extended to other criminal justice users, such as the Scottish Prison Service and British Transport Police. Why is the bill limited to the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland?
What I would say is that policing, and the bill is narrowing its scope specifically to include Police Scotland and SPA, because although biometrics can be used by other public bodies and agencies, so the NHS, for example, the way it is used in policing is very, very unique. So there will be occasions, for example, when it's taken without the individual's consent for important operational reasons. So therefore, the context within which biometrics is taken in policing and the SPA, I think, is different to any other context otherwise. I think where we will reflect, and I will reflect quite carefully, and the committee may well signal this in its report, is can we give more consideration to where there are cross-jurisdictional issues? So British Transport Police would probably be one of the most obvious ones in that regard, or the National Crime Agency. I think there's probably a little bit more consideration we have to give for bodies like that have a policing implication. And so I've not reached necessarily a decision on whether oversight to other policing bodies should be extended or not. So I keep an open mind on that. Also keep an open mind as to kind of broadening the Commissioner's remit in the future. I do think it's important from the moment the Commissioner begins and develops that code of practice that it is relatively specific and to a degree narrow and focused on policing. If, for example, in the future, after there was time for the code of practice to embed and the Commissioner to embed in his or her role, if in the future there was a suggestion that it should be widened to the Scottish Prison Service, for example, then I don't think that is something that should be off the table. But I think for the moment the Commissioner is appointed, I think it should be very focused on the SPA Police Scotland. That's my view.
Thank you. I'm pleased you mentioned BTP and the National Crime Agency. I think colleagues have questions on that, but can I ask as a general principle, is there a danger if they are not included at this stage that we could find double standards beginning to emerge regarding both the collection and the use of biometric data?
I don't think the comparisons are necessarily being done with apples and apples, apples and oranges here, because data, although it is biometric data, is used in a very different, very specific way by Police Scotland and SPA, particularly the Forensics Department, obviously, than I think in any other scenario where biometrics may be retained. So I think there has to be a very unique look at the context within which that data is preserved, retained, collected and so on and disposed of, that is very, very unique to policing in comparison to others. So what may apply to policing isn't necessarily the case that those same rules should apply to other public bodies. There may be good principles and guiding principles that other bodies could look at, should look at, are generally good practice. But there are some very, very specific instances, of course, which the member knows very well in the numerous roles he has had, that policing is a very specific context, which I think is very different to any other public body.
I note that you're going to pick up on that, Cabinet Secretary, but of course the legislation doesn't cover all the police operating in Scotland. It just covers Police Scotland. So I'm pleased that you've undertaken to look at that. Can I also put to you the suggestion that other public authorities and private actors who utilise biometric technology should come within the Commissioner's ambit? And the particular example that many people will be aware of is excuse me, public space CCTV, which is used by councils. Again, is there any reason why that shouldn't form part and or be under consideration for this level of scrutiny?
So if criminality had taken place, or the suggestion of criminality had taken place in a public space, and that CCTV footage was then passed on, that CCTV footage would then be passed on to police. You know, there would be a pub brawl, for example, and it'd be captured by the CCTV cameras that are in a public space. That would then, you know, you'd think in the course of things be passed on to Police Scotland, and they then would have to make sure they abided by or have regard to, excuse me, the code of practice with oversight from Police Scotland. So I think where there's a criminal element, or even a potential criminal element, that would be very much captured by the code and captured by the oversight of the Commissioner. I just go back to my point I made previously. I won't labour it too much, but I do think the context within which data is captured for policing purposes is very, very unique. And, you know, that is the priority area for again, I think, very good and understandable reasons, because it can have, you know, there cannot be I think, a bigger effect on an individual's human rights than restricting their liberty, for example, if they end up in prison or jail. So the powers of our criminal justice system are very, very unique and can have very lasting and quite relatively large impacts on significant impacts, I should say, on people's lives. So for that reason, there's a good reason, I think, for a focus on policing. We shouldn't dismiss or shouldn't take off the table a possible broadening of that remit, but I think for the initial phase, it should be focused on policing. That's my view.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. I wonder if you could provide maybe your thoughts on this, Cabinet Secretary. If we're referring to the new post as the Commissioner for Biometrics, is there a possibility that the public is going to expect that the Commissioner will be able to look at biometrics in the wider sense, and whoever has taken them, and he may have to spend, or she may have to spend, a lot of time, you know, explaining, no, we're just looking at this within the context of the police and the SPA?
I think that's a very fair point. It's something I remember raising with my officials at the very inception of this bill, and when we were doing some of the drafting, I should say, of this bill, and having a meeting with my officials and with other colleagues that, you know, could there be a misunderstanding of the role of Commissioner? And I thought, you know, we kind of wrestled, and I wrestled with this quite a fair bit, and it goes back to actually both Mr Finney and Mr MacArthur's point, that if in the future it was broadened, then if you had the role as being the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner for Policing, then broadening that role in the future would be extremely difficult. And I can absolutely see where in the future, kind of once the position is embedded and the code of practice embedded, there may well be good reason for that role to be extended to other public bodies, which could be entirely out of policing, could be the NHS or so on and so forth. Now, you could come back and probably change the title, but it's then whether or not that's a whole rebranding exercise. And so I think there's pros and cons. And again, I'll keep a relatively open mind. I suppose we're also looking at other role counterparts in England and Wales, I suppose, as well. But I think there's good argument for both. But ultimately, we thought if the role's extended, then we'd have to change the title, and that would probably be more challenging in the future.
Okay. Jenny.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Morning.
As you'll be aware, the Commissioner's role is initially anticipated that it will be on a part-time basis, and you'll be aware from some of our previous evidence sessions there's been a bit of debate around this subject. I wonder if you could share with the committee the rationale for why that's the case, and if it's something you might, consider revisiting in the future.
Yeah, again, I noticed that in a number of the evidence sessions that were taken, and again, I refer to perhaps the evidence that Professor Wells gave, and a number of other interested parties have given. I mean, if I just take his example, obviously as the kind of comparator example in England and Wales, he works part-time. He's 0.6 of a full-time equivalent in his role as Commissioner. His remit covers 43 police forces, but in fairness, in respect to only fingerprints and DNA, his office resourced to a maximum by 4 officials, full-time equivalents, who obviously do a good job in supporting him in the functions that he has. So that, while functions do not include the development and monitoring of a code of practice as proposed with our Commissioner, they do include, for example, considering applications from police forces to retain biometric data under certain circumstances, which is not proposed for the Scottish Commissioner. So I suppose in all of that, having taken due regard of the differences between the Commissioner in England and Wales and our proposals for the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, we think 0.6 of a full-time equivalent to cover the oversight of a wider group of biometric data, so not just fingerprints and DNA, but managed by one police force, albeit the second largest in the UK, and the Scottish Police Authority would be around about the right call. Also, the Commissioner will be supported by 3 full-time members of staff, again in comparison to England and Wales, where it's 4 full-time staff. So I think considering the kind of comparators was the best way to do this, I think there will be quite an undertaking in the first year. I think the main focus will be obviously in developing that code of practice with stakeholders, potentially with the public as well. So, should we keep an open mind in that? Yes, absolutely. If the demands from the Commissioner comes back to us to say that, no, this means that I should go from 0.6 to full time, then yeah, we should absolutely keep an open mind to that. And obviously, again, as we would always do, and as I would always do, we'll keep an open mind to the committee's recommendation in this regard, because you've taken evidence from quite a number of sources.
Thank you, that's helpful. In terms of the financial memorandum, the bill shows that the first year costs will be met by the Scottish Government, and thereafter they will fall to the Scottish Parliament. And the memorandum doesn't give any resource though for research or for public engagement, which might be carried out by the Commissioner. Is the assumption then that that would be met by the SPCB, or would the Government step in at that point to meet those costs?
Yeah, I think maybe just the way the financial memorandum was presented, perhaps there's a way we can be more explicit come future stages of the bill. The public engagement budget is made up of the travel and subsistence budget of £4,000 per annum, and also partly from the website maintenance budget, because obviously there'll be a strong online element to that engagement, of £15,000 per annum. So I think both are pretty generous estimates in the context of other comparator bodies to public engagement. And engaging with the public will be a very key part of that, both face-to-face, but also, as I say, online presence being important as well. Any running costs relating to research will be sourced from the professional fees budget, and that's £20,000 per annum set out by the financial memorandum.
Thank you.
Shona.
Good morning. You mentioned the code of practice earlier on, and I want to turn to some of the detail of that, given its importance. You'll be aware of the evidence from the Independent Advisory Group on biometrics that recommended that the code of practice should be established in legislation, and indeed they went further to say that it should also come into force at the same time as the Commissioner takes office. You'll be aware that other witnesses have said something similar to that. Is that something you would consider? And obviously, so far, that's not been a recommendation that's been accepted, but is that something, in the light of the evidence, that you would consider putting it onto a statutory footing?
I suppose my preference would be not to, for a couple of reasons. It's quite a strong preference. So, first and foremost, I'd want the Commissioner to be the one that develops the code of practice through his or her engagement with the public, with stakeholders and whoever else. If we were to introduce the code of practice, then it would be obviously heavily influenced by Scottish ministers and therefore not as independent, well, not independent at all in that regard. It would be influenced and driven by Scottish Government in that regard. So I think the independence point is hugely important. If we did put it on the statutory footing at the same time as the Commissioner, then obviously we'd have to develop it. So I think it's better it's developed by the independent Commissioner. I suppose the second point I'd make is that the way we've done it in relation to ministers having to come forward with the date on which the code of practice comes into effect, and that's been done by affirmative procedure, and we'd have to also at that point lay the code of practice, means that there would be parliamentary scrutiny. So there wouldn't be any you know, we wouldn't want to avoid parliamentary scrutiny, of course, on the code of practice, but there simply could be no suggestion that that was the case, because this committee, I suspect, would have the ability to do that. So I think we've got, again, the right balance of ensuring, or the right priorities in ensuring that a code of practice is independent, but also receives parliamentary scrutiny. I suppose the third point, which is often made in legislation, is an important one, and somewhat harks back to what Liam MacArthur and John Finney said, was if it was in a statutory footing, there would be a certain degree of inflexibility with the code of practice. And we're talking about really emerging technologies, so we're maybe focused at the moment on live facial recognition or DNA and fingerprints, but, you know, come 20 years down the line, even 20 years, 5 to 10 years down the line, you know, what emerging technologies could look like, you know, are probably beyond most of our comprehensions here. So there has to be a degree of flexibility that I think if the code of practice on a statutory footing, you just wouldn't have.
I mean, I guess that would depend on the nature of the code, because I think there's a question further on about whether or not, which I don't want to preempt, but about the detail of how detailed the code is and how segmented it is. I mean, obviously the Independent Advisory Group has recommended this because I guess it's about the importance of the code. Is your belief, therefore, at the moment that you think that the code will be seen as important and as solid, if you like, whether or not it's on a statutory basis? I think from the recollection of the evidence from the Independent Advisory Group was that they felt, because so much of the detail of the operation of this will rely on the code, as the code is brought forward, that's why, in essence, they were recommending it's established on a statutory footing. You would answer that in what way?
Well, I can see the point where the IAG is coming from. I can understand why people want stuff in statute. I've kind of passed a number of bills in this Parliament legislation, and I know there's often a desire to have things on the face of the bill because, one, yes, I think you're absolutely right, and the IAG is correct in the point that people can sometimes view that as meaning that it's more solid, it's got more, it gives it more effect, and so on and so forth. But I think it's undeniable that when we put something in primary legislation, the ability to change it, to amend it, is far more difficult than if it was in potentially as a code of practice, as we're suggesting here. And I think that's really important with the type of issue we're talking about here. That it has that flexibility. In terms of the significance and the importance of that code of practice, that will certainly be for the Commissioner to highlight in the public awareness part of his or her job. But also, frankly, the stakeholders that it applies to, in this case Police Scotland and the SPA, how they act towards the Commissioner and the code of practice will also send an important signal in relation to how important that code of practice is. And I've got no doubt whatsoever, having spoken to the Chief Constable about the biometrics bill that's coming through the Parliament, I have no doubt at all that Police Scotland will treat it with the absolute importance that it deserves.
Okay.
Cabinet Secretary, significant concern, it is significant, has been raised about the effect of the code of practice. As things stand, Police Scotland and SPA will simply have to have regard to the code rather than have a duty to comply with it. Do you think it should be changed to a duty to comply?
I don't. I think in my opening answer to the question that you put, I think the dynamic is hugely important. I was quite taken by Professor Wells' own evidence in this. I thought it was very strong that he felt that having the powers that he had actually, one, was effective, which is the most important point in terms of making sure police forces comply. But secondly, was good in terms of the dynamic and the relationship that he enjoyed with the police forces, which meant that he could be quite open, and they in turn were quite open with him also. So I think we shouldn't downplay the seriousness of the power that he has in terms of alerting the ministers in the Parliament if the police don't have regard to the code of practice. I just look towards my officials for a second, because I'm just checking whether or not there was also a power to inform the court if there wasn't regard to the code of practice as well, in terms of court of session application as well.
No, there's no power to inform the court that the police are having regard to the code or not, but they do have the power to, the Commissioner, the Biometrics Commissioner has the power to require the production of information from the police or the SPA to determine whether those bodies are having regard to the code of practice.
Okay.
So that's the kind of
So I think
information requirement power.
Yeah. So I think if there's any recommendations that come out of the committee's report in terms of strengthening that power, again, I'll always keep an open mind to that. I just wouldn't want it to get to a position where the enforcement powers are so heavy that there's it affects the dynamic of that relationship. But that may well be something that, again, consideration can be given to once the Commissioner is embedded and the code of practice is also embedded.
I think one of the main concerns when this bill was muted, right at the very beginning, it was up there and we were asked about this, is the Commissioner actually going to have powers? Is he just going to be a toothless person in charge of this? Or will he have actual powers to ensure a duty to comply, to ensure that he can investigate and scrutinise so that the public have confidence? And I'm not sure, as things stand, the public would have confidence as far as we go, naming and shaming without actually the power to investigate properly and scrutinise properly, perhaps in advance, and also just having regard to, does sound a bit weak at this stage.
Well, I would just say, and I take the point that you're making, Convener. I'm certainly not dismissing it. I think, you know, this is one element of the bill. You know, we always thought would come under a pretty severe degree of scrutiny. And again, I'll keep an open mind to suggestions that I made. But I think that in one sense you underestimate yourself and, you know, as a committee, because I can tell you, you know, nobody likes being hauled in front of a committee. You know, we're happy to come in front of committee and answer questions, but if you're not complying with a code of practice or a regulation and you get hauled in front of a committee and interrogated for an hour or 2 hours on that, that's enough to make you think twice about whether you're doing the right thing or not. And I say that as a government minister for 7 years, but also I'm pretty sure I could say the same when I talk to my colleagues in Police Scotland and the SPA. So I wouldn't downplay the kind of public element to this, that no doubt if there was a failure to have regard to the code, then I don't think this committee would be one that would sit back, or any other committees, frankly, this Parliament would be ones to sit back and allow the police not to get kind of off the hook with that. I'm sure there would be some kind of really pretty intense political scrutiny. I suspect some pretty intense media scrutiny of that as well. But your point is taken, but I hope we just don't downplay that public element of it. I think it's quite an important element to the Commissioner's powers.
I think the point is, Cabinet Secretary, legislation should be strong enough, and it shouldn't be, you know, relying on maybe the committee looking and doing that scrutiny role. And let me tell you why this is still something of a concern. When Police Scotland and SAPA have stated that the bill should perhaps refer specifically to forensic services and not, in fact, to the whole of the SPA, then there seems to be a rolling back again, which causes a little bit of concern. What's your view on this? Is that a reasonable suggestion?
I mean, I can't speak for SPA, and I don't think it was a suggestion of rolling back. It was maybe, from their point of view, trying to be focused on that part of SPA, which largely deals with biometrics, the Forensics Services Department. But I don't agree with the suggestion that it should be limited. I think it should be for the Scottish Police Authority. I mean, largely there's a legal reason for that. I mean, the Forensic Service Department is a department. It's not a legal entity in its own right. So in legislating for it, you know, you could just change the name of the department or whatever else, because it is just a department, it's not a legal entity. So it wouldn't be right legally to do it, but also, you know, again, future-proofing the legislation. We don't know what other responsibilities potentially in the future the SPA might subsume. I'm not prejudging and not suggesting there are any, but to future-proof the legislation, I think it should be Police Scotland and the SPA. I don't think there should be any narrowing of the focus.
I suppose that what I feel with legislation is, if it's always as precise as it can be and no room for, well, how do we interpret that? Having regard doesn't definitely seem to me there's a lot of manoeuvrability and wobble room there. A duty to comply is quite different. But I welcome your view that it should be the whole of the SP, and for the reasons you've just outlined.
Thank you, Convener, and morning, Cabinet Secretary. Just on this issue of the Code of Practice, how would you respond to those that would say that the Code of Practice is ineffective if there's no legal remedy for an instance where someone doesn't give any regard to the Code of Practice?
I mean, I might just refer to David and other colleagues around the kind of legal implications, but you know, there is a section in the bill, section 7, that covers actions in which the code might be a relevant consideration. For example, if an action was taken against the police, for talking sake, regarding the unlawful, you know, retention of data, in short, the code could be a relevant consideration in any action against the police or SPA. So a failure to have regard is not in itself a matter to go to the court. But for example, if you were concerned about unlawful detention or even collection of data, this could be part, and Section 7.2 allows that, you know, that fact to be part of any action that's taken in front of the court. So, you know, there could be a point where this legislation could absolutely be relevant to that. But I don't know if David, is the kind of legal head here, has anything more to add to that.
No, I think that's what you said is correct. So the code can be taken into account in relation to any action against the police. But there's also I mean, to have regard to the code, the police need to, or the SP can only depart from the code if there's a good and case-specific reason for doing so. It can't simply depart from the code because it disagrees with the general tenor of the code. there has to be good reason for departing from the code in a specific case. And there is probably a public law remedy in relation to not having regard to the code, and that would be judicial review of the police or the SPA's actions. So there is a form of judicial oversight in relation to the police having regard to the code. So not having regard to the code does not. There are some consequences for not having regard to the code. There is a public duty for the police and the SPA to have regard to this code, and there's administrative law consequences if that's not done. So there's always a possibility of judicial review.
Is the point about judicial review explicitly referred to in the legislation?
I wouldn't imagine so.
It's not explicitly referred to in the legislation because it's not needed to be referred to in legislation. The courts have supervisory jurisdiction over public bodies and their actions, and they would have supervisory jurisdiction in the case of police and the SPA and the exercise of their functions in relation to the code. So there's no need for specific reference to that in the bill.
I'm sure you'd agree, Cabinet Secretary, it's important that the public have confidence in the bill. From that point of view, do you think the bill would be strengthened if, on the face of the bill, it was explicitly stated that a mechanism for complaints to be made to the Commissioner?
You know, at the moment, if there's specific complaints around the handling of data, of course, they can be made to the Information Commissioner. So again, I go back to my previous point, the convener in our opening question to me. We've taken a fair bit of consideration about non-duplication of roles, making sure that the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner complements the role of the Information Commissioner. So at the moment there is an avenue to make a complaint about the handling of data, and that can be investigated. So this role isn't designed to duplicate any of that. But I take the point he's making around public confidence and perhaps being explicit about what a commissioner can and can't do.
So if an individual had concerns about collection and processing of biometric data, where would they take those concerns?
The gambit of the Information Commissioner, I'm just looking at visuals, I don't think there's anything that would preclude the individual at this stage, even before this bill is introduced, of going to the Information Commissioner if they feel that the biometrics data is being unlawfully collected, held, retained or disposed.
So why would they go to the Information Commissioner? What's the logic behind going to the Information Commissioner as opposed to the Biometrics Commissioner?
Biometrics Commissioner again looks at, will develop the code of practice, will be the oversight mechanism for police and the SPA in relation to that code of practice. So his or her job is to have that oversight function. To make sure that there's a duty to comply to that code of practice, which we'd expect to do in kind of quite wide consultation, and again up to her or his discretion around whether or not that's done with the public. But you know, I think giving the public a range of options to be able to go to, I can see the attraction in that. But at the moment, if there's an avenue that exists for an individual to make a complaint about the way their data is held, I'm not sure having another avenue for the individual to go down would be helpful. I think it maybe just muddies the landscape. If you wanted to come in, Ellen.
Thank you.
If I could, sorry, if I may just add to the Cabinet Secretary's answer there. The Information Commissioner's work is very much driven by complaints from individual members of the public. For the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, his remit is driven by identifying systemic deficiencies. There's been a lot of discussion with the UK Information Commissioner's Office on this, about the complementarity of the roles, and they very much welcome the creation of the new Scottish Biometrics Commissioner and view that role as complementary to their own. Therefore, when we're thinking about the UK Information Commissioner, as I say, that is driven by individual members of the public complaining, and of course the Information Commissioner has certain powers of sanction to fine organisations, etc. It could be the private sector or the public sector. But in respect of the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner, we are talking about day in, day out review of biometric data being used by police and the SPA. And certainly in terms of public confidence, this Commissioner is all about driving improvement, improving transparency and raising public awareness. And I think the provisions in the bill make those duties very clear. They do leave, the bill is drafted in such a way as to allow discretion to the Biometrics Commissioner in how he or she will carry out those functions, but the functions themselves are actually quite clear.
It might be useful, just, and the clerks have just drawn my attention to this, that last week the IOC published this comment about facial recognition, that the absence of a statutory code of practice and national guidelines contributes to inconsistent practice and increases the risk of compliance failures and undermines confidence in the use of technology. And I thought, Cabinet Secretary, you would want to just be aware of that comment and the context in which it was made.
Your clerks are, as always, very diligent, and yes, we will, of course, have that due regard to that comment. It's an important point.
Thank you. Fulton.
Convener, good morning, Cabinet Secretary. As you'll be aware, the bill is introduced does not provide an ethics advisory group to be established, but I know that you've committed to such a group being formed. Can you confirm if that's still your view and what the rationale is behind it not being on the face of the bill?
Yes, I mean, I think the Ethics Advisory Group is absolutely important, and I accept the IAG's recommendation to establish an Ethics Advisory Group. I made a public commitment to that. My officials are scoping the remit and the membership of that group. My expectation is very much that the Ethics Advisory Group is established around the same time as the new Biometrics Commissioner. I never envisaged a group having a statutory footing, I should say, and nor, from recollection, did the IAG. I need to be persuaded kind of on that specific point. We are still very much, in terms of the remit of that group, that's still very much under something that's under consideration. My officials are in touch with, I suppose, the kind of counterpart in England and Wales, the Biometrics and Forensics Ethics Group, who operate in England and Wales, to help inform that remit and what that membership is. So we've got some members of the IAG, they volunteer to assist with the scoping of that. I would welcome their views on how we should progress moving forward. So no, I can absolutely state that that is our still our aim to have that ethics advisory group, but I think it would be coming into force in around the time of the new commissioner.
I know that you're still looking at the remit, Cabinet Secretary, but would it be your intention that the group is independent of government, and do you think it will be established as a permanent advisor to the Commissioner?
Again, I suppose because it's not in statute, that there would be an argument for putting on statute. Some would make that would give it some level of permanency. But you know, I just think again, we have the Ethics Advisory Group, we have the group that's looking at the emerging technologies in the future, and there has to be a degree of flexibility within those groups. So again, I'll look at what the committee's recommendations are on that front. Yes, I accept they absolutely should be independent. I think the group, and I look to my officials, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the group in England and Wales is largely made up of academics. I think I'd want it to be a bit broader than that up here in Scotland. It's my initial view. It's no slight on academics at all. I think there'll be a number of academics probably on that, but I think it shouldn't be made largely of academics. I think there's probably other practitioners that we'd want and stakeholders that we want to be part of that group as well. But yes, they should be independent. And you know, I think their advice to the Commissioner would be a very helpful source of advice indeed.
Yeah, thanks very much. Just one final question, Cabinet Secretary, on that. You touched on it there about the membership of the proposed group. Have you got any early thoughts on who those other stakeholders that might be members would be, in addition to academics, as you say? Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't want to put any names or suggestions, I think, to kind of prejudge and preempt at the moment. All I would say is that looking at the similar body in England and Wales, I think, which is largely made up of academics, I think we'd want a better mix. If that is an okay phrase to use, I think we'd want a wider mix and a greater diversity in terms of the people, professions and expertise that are inputting into that group.
Okay, thank you.
Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. The ethos behind the bill is to maintain public confidence in the independence of the Commissioner, and he or she will be appointed by and responsible to the Parliament. But Scottish ministers have final approval of the Code of Practice. Can you maybe explain why this approach was taken, and should the Code of Practice be laid before Parliament for scrutiny and debate?
Yes. So the Code of Practice, members right, obviously has to have approval from Scottish ministers. I mean, the reason for that is largely to make sure there's an alignment with affordability and policy coherence, and they are important considerations for us to have. Clearly, if there was a code of practice that was developed that was just completely unaffordable, and again went in a completely different, non-progressive direction, I don't imagine it would, but, direction that we did not view as being progressive at all and quite regressive, then and that's against our policy alignment, then we'd clearly want to be able to influence that. In terms of parliamentary scrutiny, I may have answered this in part to a question previously, but we have to bring to this Parliament and lay as an affirmative procedure the day in which the code comes into effect, and also lay the code on the same day, and therefore there would be, I suspect, rigorous parliamentary scrutiny of that code.
Thank you. And if, for whatever reason, ministers don't approve the draft Code of Practice, they have to provide the Commissioner for the reasons for not doing so. So would those reasons be made public? And what happens if the draft code isn't approved? Is it simply revised until ministers do approve it?
Yeah, there's no explicit mention in the bill of making those reasons public. And I think there are times when biometric data in particular we're discussing, there may be a need for some element of discretion. But I think we should try, as always, in government, to be as open-minded, of course, to be as transparent as possible. So I think, but I would certainly keep an open mind, and the government would keep an open mind to making those reasons public. I think there could be good reasons why. I think if we were to reject the code, I think there would be a strong, understandable pressure from parliamentarians to understand why the government didn't do that. So in some way, shape or form, I think we'd absolutely have to explain that in public. There may need to be appropriate caveats around certain things, but to be honest, yeah, I think we should look to see to make those reasons public in almost every instance.
Okay, thank you.
Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Sticking with the code, before submitting the draft code for approval, the Commissioner is required to consult with stakeholders. Can you confirm, does that category include the public? And on that consultation, is it about what to include? Are they consulting on what should go in ultimately, or do you envisage the Commissioner drafting the code and then consulting on that draft?
Yeah, it's a good question. A good couple of questions. I mean, we're trying to give the Commissioner as much independence to develop the code as possible, as he or she sees fit. Section 8 in the bill, which prescribes and enables the Commissioner to consult a list of kind of prescribed stakeholders, but there is within that kind of catch-all of any other relevant stakeholders. And again, the Commissioner is independent, parliamentary approval and appointment. So I wouldn't want to prejudge or kind of push them into a position. But I think consulting with the public would be a hugely important part of that. In terms of whether it should be done, before drafting the code or once the code is drafted, again, I would have to respect the independence of the Commissioner in this regard, who would be appointed by Parliament. But I've always found that, consultations is what the government does, of course, consultation, before we introduce a piece of legislation, and often guidelines is the better way to go, as opposed to trying to bolt on at the end of things. So consultation in advance of the drafting of a code of practice, I would suggest, would be a better way to do it. But ultimately, and I have to take a bit of a step back here and allow the independent commissioners to do as he or she sees fit.
Thank you. And if we start from a position that says biometrics are evolving fairly rapidly, and I think you said earlier the Commissioner's responsibilities could extend over time, do you take a view on whether a single code of practice ultimately will be the best way forward, or is there scope, would it be possible and indeed advantageous were there to be more than one code of practice?
Yeah, no, I take the point. There could be subsections of a code of practice. There could be numerous codes of practice depending on the technology. It would make the most sense where possible and pragmatic, of course, for the stakeholders involved, i.e. Police Scotland and the SPA, for there to be one code of practice which they could refer to and have regard to. That's why I think it's important that it is a code of practice, because if we had this in primary legislation on the face of a bill, changing that code of practice would be difficult. So, I mean, I would envisage one code of practice covering, having the flexibility to evolve given technologies that emerge. But again, it could be that the independent commissioner decides that actually this needs subsections, or there needs to be more than one code of practice, in which case those things should be given consideration.
Thank you.
I wonder if you just confirm, Cabinet Secretary, given the legal and ethical issues surrounding the collection of biometric data, would you also expect the Code of Practice to definitively outline specific data protection in terms of human rights and consideration of what must be taken into account?
I think I would absolutely have that expectation, is the short answer. I mean, pretty much the primary reason why we brought forward, well, first the IAG and then this piece of legislation and eventually the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner and the Code of Practice is because of the human rights considerations and the ethical considerations. So if that was not a consistent golden thread throughout the entire Code of Practice, it would give me some pretty severe concerns. And that goes back to my point around why Scottish ministers should approve. And I suspect where Parliament's consideration will be when they come to approve via the affirmative procedure, that if, for whatever reason, the Code of Practice was regressive in terms of human rights, well, we'd want to have a say in that.
Okay, thank you. Rona.
Yes, we touched on this earlier, I think, in your exchange with John Finneys. The Cabinet said you'll be aware that committee has received evidence that there may be potential legal issues around biometric data which is collected in Scotland but been stored in UK national databases. Can you say how you envisage the Scottish Commissioner having oversight of this biometric data being gathered out in Scotland and stored out with Scotland? Who would have legal responsibility for that?
Well, I mean, the bill itself doesn't give the Scottish Biometrics Commissioner direct access to UK databases, but where Police Scotland or the SPA choose to store that biometric data will be a matter that falls within the oversight functions of the Commissioner under this bill. The fact that biometric data is being stored in UK databases could be subject of reports and recommendations by the Commissioner, which could inform further consideration of the matter.
So, sorry, just to clarify that, so it's up for negotiation whether it's UK or the Scottish Commissioner?
So the Biometric Commissioner doesn't have absolute access and direct access to UK databases, but if Police Scotland or indeed the SPA choose to store that data on a UK, choose to store that biometric data, will be absolutely under the oversight function of the Commissioner. So there shouldn't be an issue or an issue around whether that data is stored on a UK database. But again, I just kind of look to officials for clarification. Nodding heads is always generally a good sign.
Okay.
That concludes our line of questioning. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and your officials for attending today. I suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave. 3 is feedback from the Justice Subcommittee on Policing on its meeting of 7th of November. I refer members to paper 3, which is a paper by the clerks. Following the verbal report, there will be an opportunity for brief comments or questions. John Finney to provide that feedback.
Thank you, Convener. And as you say, the subcommittee met on the 7th of November, and members have a paper within their overall pack. And we took evidence on police custody provisions from staff associations and Police Scotland. Some of the issues included the physical state of some of the custody suites, staffing structures, remote supervision, and the arrangements for the transfer of some of those held in custody to other more suitable facilities elsewhere in the country. Members also discussed their draft pre-budget scrutiny report and their work programme. Following the session, members agreed to highlight the concerns on capital budget issues to support custody centres and address the issues raised in evidence. Members also agreed a schedule of meetings and the types of organisations and individuals to be invited to give evidence for the new facial recognition inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you. Do members have any comments or questions for John or on that report? No, that being the case, that concludes the public part of today's meeting. Our next meeting will be on Tuesday, 19th of November, when we will take evidence on the petition to establish a register of judicial interests.